The window had opened. English football was at an important crossroads. The dominance of Stan Cullis and Matt Busby was waning, and the maximum wage was about to be abolished. This is the story of Burnley and their incredible league title of 1960. Burnley was your archetypal key industrial town at the turn of the 19th century. Like Manchester, the town produced cotton at an enormous rate. With industry, football shortly followed. In 1888, Burnley were one of 5 Lancastrian clubs to help found the 12-team Football League. It wasn't all plain sailing, as the Clarets only cobbled together their first trophy in 1914, 12 months after their second promotion to the First Division. It came via the FA Cup and a 1-0 win over Liverpool, courtesy of the free-scoring Bert Freeman. The Great War only paused Burnley's progression, with the club's first ever league championship in 1921 in a now bloated division featuring a field of 22. The interwar depression hit the town and therefore the football club hard. In the throes of a recession, industry left Burnley, and by the late 50s it had lost a fifth of its population. Meanwhile, incoming Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan told the nation they'd never had it so good. We joined Burnley in one of their longer spells in the top division of English football. Promoted under the steam of Cliff Britton and the goals of Harry Potts, Burnley almost completed the quirky double of second-tier title and FA Cup. While second place in Division 2 would earn Burnley a place in the top flight ahead of the 1947-48 campaign, the cup final was a bit more heartbreaking. By the end of the 50s, it was patently obvious that English football was in a funk. The Football League gates had dwindled by 28% from the start of the decade, and after the Hungarians schooled England in 1953's match of the century, the country was tactically depressed as well. Ironic then that the man who delivered modern football to Hungary was born in Nelson and raised in Burnley, Jimmy Hogan. Bankrupt both financially and tactically, Burnley had to adapt if they were to be successful. The mid-50s was a crucial time for the club, as incumbent chairman Bob Lord set in motion a youth policy. This, combined with a 200 grand renovation to Turf Moor, as well as the purchasing of a 79-acre training facility at Gawthorpe Hall, looked set to modernise the club. In Charlie Ferguson, you had the eyes and ears of Burnley. He was to build on a scouting initiative that had already snapped up Tommy Cummins from a junior international tournament in Strasbourg in 1948, and Jimmy Adamson of Ashington, a north-east footballing hotbed. In fact, the area was plundered for a number of Burnley names. John Angus as a 15-year-old in 1954, whilst playing in a junior football league in Newcastle. He was of Amble in Northumberland. Jimmy Robson, who made his debut in 1956, aged just 17, had come from Pelton in County Durham. A little closer to home, Brian Miller was found, aged 15, playing in a schoolboy cup final in Blackburn in 1952, whilst John Connolly was spotted playing for St Helens Town 4 years later. Joe Brown was tasked with bringing these youngsters through the youth system and ensuring that they were ready for the first team. And when they got there to the hallowed turf of Turf Moor, they found a playing surface that was likely only bettered by the National Stadium and far removed from the mud baths of their day. Keeping the players fit was Billy Dougal, the club's innovative physiotherapist. Way beyond his time, he was a dab hand at the old ultrasound and kept a hot waxing machine to aid the players' recovery. His methods were a very early form of heat and ice in order to keep players fresh throughout the season. Dougal was a former Burnley manager until he was hospitalised in late 1957. He had kept alive a lineage of strict disciplinary standards which had been maintained since the Second World War via names like Cliff Britton, Frank Hill and Alan Brown. Dougal's permanent successor arrived in the first weeks of 58, and whilst he was able to maintain the lofty ideals of before, he returned to the club with a more modern touch. Say hello to Harry Potts. He had been intertwined with the club since the 30s, signing on as a schoolboy when he was just 16 from his hometown of Hetton-le-Hull, also the birthplace of another Burnley 60s star Ralph Coates, as well as a certain Bob Paisley. It's called a hotbed in cliched terms, a phrase I've already managed to use twice already. The former Turf Moor frontman had the correct perspective in looking both to the past for guidance and to the present for innovation. In addition to retaining the club's discipline, he borrowed the Alan Brown idea of shadow training, which helped improve the players' positioning. In fact, most training was performed with the ball in an era of cross-country and medicine ball style strength and conditioning. It made him, after Brown, the first real tracksuit manager of the club. These days, football teams played in a 2-3-5 or a 2-3-2-3 or metodo in Italian, and if they didn't utilise that, it was the WM or 3-2-2-3 or sistema in Italian. Carrying on the Burnley way of Cliff Britton, who had taken inspiration from the Italian Catenaccio and Swiss Bolt defensive styles, under Harry Potts the Clarets would continue to line up in a WW or 3-2-3-2, which sadly has no Italian name. In John Connolly and Brian Pilkington, the backbone of this system would play out as their direct running out on the wings allowed Burnley to sit deep and counter at blistering speed. Ray Pointer and Jimmy Robson were the goal scorers, Jimmy's Adamson and McIlroy the talismanic figures that helped knit the whole thing together from midfield, whilst the defence was comprised of the ever-present Brian Miller as well as John Angus and Alex Elder. And in goal, Scottish international Adam Blacklaw. It was a team that had been slowly pieced together from the youth system and the only very occasional transfer fee, those being Jimmy McIlroy's bank-breaking £8,000 transfer in 1950 and Alex Elder's 5k switch 9 years later. They had waited in the wings, occupying the top 7 as teams from Wolverhampton and Manchester hogged all the glory. Burnley had made a late dash on the top 3 towards the back end of Potts' first full season as manager, but the campaign had tailed off only into a 7th place finish in 1959. Nonetheless, it was clear that the Clarets were on the up. Now the window had opened and Burnley were primed to jump straight through it. Technological limitations and a lack of TV coverage being as they were, you're going to have to take my word for most of this football in action, all of which started on August 22nd, 1959, when Burnley pitched up at Elland Road and proceeded to blow their Yorkshire foes out of the water early on. Whilst a penalty concession did allow Leeds to creep back into the game, an opening day 3-2 victory was well deserved, Ray Pointer ultimately scoring the winner. A blisteringly hot start accompanied a balmy old evening in Turf Moor's curtain raiser 3 days later when 3 goals were found in the opening 20 minutes in a 5-2 triumph over Everton. Starts like that ought to have kept Burnley fresh in a hectic start to the season, except newly promoted West Ham turned up and stuck 3 beyond them at Turf Moor. Thankfully, Burnley's next opponents were more giving as Ray Pointer's header sent Everton to the bottom of the division on September the 2nd. And whilst the Clarets made an impressive start down at Stamford Bridge 3 days later, a team that would ship 91 goals that season would capitalise on a series of comical defensive errors to put Burnley to the sword 4-1. A higher defensive line and a suffocating pressure under the still immense September heat helped drown out the challenges of Preston and West Brom in the subsequent weeks as Burnley kept themselves towards the top end of the table. Back at Deepdale in the reverse, however, Tom Finney ran the show and it was only Alex Elder's man of the match display that kept the Burnley loss down to just 1 goal. They'd get back on the winning side of the score sheet in the next weeks but toiled against both Newcastle United and Birmingham City as they had to overturn a deficit against the former and really ought to have stuck more than 3 beyond the basement boys of Birmingham a week later. As October drew in, Burnley were in 4th, only a point behind Bill Nicholson's Spurs, and had the honour of recording the most victories thus far, 7 out of 10, 2 more than the London leaders. In a more modern system, the Clarets would have topped the table already. But good things come to those who wait. That couldn't have been more obvious in Burnley's next encounter at White Hart Lane of all places, when Brian Miller snatched a draw from the jaws of defeat on 87 minutes. It was a match sadly not at full strength since both players lost hugely influential figures, Dave Mackay and Danny Blanchflower for the hosts and Jimmy McIlroy for the visitors thanks to a home international. Scotland beat Northern Ireland 4-0, if you were wondering. No, okay, let's skip through the next two fixtures since two local derbies turned up the princely sum of note. First, Blackpool stunning the Clarets by netting 4 at Turf, and then a trip to Ewood Park resulting in 0 points, thanks in part to John Connolly's absence owing to yet more international football. Next was the informed team in the country, Manchester City, as Burnley had sunk to 7th place without a trace. Whilst the Clarets were free-flowing going forward, they had yet to stitch it together defensively, conceding 10 more than leader Spurs after just 13 fixtures. Thankfully, Burnley had a Jimmy McIlroy both free of injury and free of the clutches of international football for once, and the performances of both he and Ray Pointer drove a dramatic 4-3 win which got Burnley back on track. Or should have done, had a trip down to Luton not returned just the 1 point. Next was one of the finer teams not just in England but the world over, the reigning champions, Stan Cullis Wolves. And for this one, we actually have some footage of at least one goal. Wolves were supposed to have turned up at the wrong point in the season, but instead Burnley blew them away thanks to a McIlroy performance for the ages. Whilst a trip to Hillsborough and just a point spoke to a still inconsistent Burnley side, the next visitors to Turf Moor were on the wrong end of a much needed hiding. Nottingham Forest, reigning FA Cup holders, were hit with 8 of the best, 3 of which came at the hands of Jimmy Robson before half-time. Those of a more pessimistic persuasion might have leaned more on Forest effectively playing with 10 men due to a defensive injury. That was put to one side a few days later when a crunch game at the top saw the points shared at Craven Cottage in a match billed McIlroy versus Johnny Haynes. Entering the festive period still in the conversation, Burnley performed better against local rivals Bolton, slapping them for 4 before the pièce de résistance thus far, another 4 goals, this time on their travels to Highbury. It was a win which owed a lot to Jimmy McIlroy's injury dictating a deeper position to the playmaker. Afforded more room, the Burnley man had the entire Arsenal team on toast, to use a more modern vernacular. They'd be missing that same McIlroy later in the week, of course, to injury, when Leeds turned up and pinched both points, but a Boxing Day delight saw off Manchester United at Old Trafford. They, of course, still overcoming with the decimation of their team from less than 2 years prior. 2 days later though, they would have ample revenge at Turf Moor, as McIlroy was brought back way too soon and Busby's side overran the host 4-1. It kept Burnley at arm's length in the title race, entering a new year and a new decade, 3 points behind Bill Nick's Spurs with Preston a buffer in between and Bastard Rovers trailing Burnley on goal average. From the pristine turf at home to a playing surface at the bowling ground suited for pigs, Burnley nonetheless returned home muddy with both points sticking 5 beyond West Ham, ending their near immaculate home form. And since this video is about the league season, I'll just visit the FA Cup briefly here, since it was the Clarets' next game. Did the title race's outsiders get a shot in the arm from going all the way? Did they bow out early and label it a cliched blessing in disguise? Well, no, not really, yet they played enough games to warrant a trip out to Wembley. Lincoln in the 3rd round, Swansea in the 4th round, Bradford in the 5th round and Blackburn in the quarter-finals. 8 matches in total thanks to 4 replayed ties, the difference being that Burnley dragged the first 3 back to Turf Moor to dispatch of them in the replay, whilst Blackburn were handed the home advantage in the quarter-final replay. The last laugh would belong to Burnley however, since Blackburn did get their precious Wembley day out but were pathetic in a 3-0 defeat. They'd be back in about 30 years to be good at football. For Burnley though, it was all about the now, and in January they skated past Chelsea in the league before more injuries ensured they would toil to a goalless draw at the Hawthorns. Although Burnley had crept up to second, the gap to leader Spurs had grown to 4 points. Immediately, that deficit was shrunk, thanks to difference maker Jimmy Robson against his hometown club Newcastle, as well as Spurs' point at Preston. Burnley wouldn't play in the league until the 27th, and when they did, Bolton stole 2 points thanks to an uncharacteristic error from goalkeeper Adam Blacklaw. Thankfully, when the Clarets had been given a weekend off, Spurs had been unable to capitalise, and entering March, the stage was set for Spurs' trip to East Lancashire. It was a typical 1-2 punch from Burnley, first a Ray Pointer header and then, when Spurs committed far too many bodies forward, the goal that sealed both points courtesy of Connolly. In the first of a tempestuous trilogy, the Clarets prevailed over Blackburn next in a slow cooker of a 1-0 league win before bowing out of the cup to the same opposition after unforgivably throwing away a 3-goal lead in the second game. Nonetheless, ahead of the visit of Arsenal on March 19th, Burnley's distractions were removed. They were third behind leaders Spurs and perpetual contenders Wolves, but their 5-point deficit belied the fact that their 2 games in hand kept them important in the race. Burnley washed away the cup depression with a clinical performance that they appeared to only save for the Gunners in both league contests that season, thanks to another crucial John Connolly goal. 12 days later, the aberration. 12 days later, the result that had long been promised by a Wolves side that were smarting from their European Cup exit to Barcelona. Having shipped 9 across the 2 ties to the Spaniards, they inflicted similar on Harry Potts' men, signalling their title ambition with 6. With Spurs slipping up once again, it made things even more interesting. In theory, fate was in Burnley's hands with a 4-point gap to the leaders and 2 games in hand, but there was a goal average of .43 to make up. Whether that's a lot or not, I've not a clue. It's too much maths for me. A direct Burnley were able to salvage a point from a sensational Sheffield Wednesday in a typical 3-3 draw. It was the match that killed Bobby Sife's career at Burnley. He would find out via the local newspaper that he was dropped, and that fact severed the relationship between he and the manager. A week later, as Wolves' game fell foul to international football and Spurs slumped to a Goodison Park defeat, Burnley weren't too cracking themselves, sneaking a 1-0 win over a Forest side that they had pumped by 8 a few months prior. The Clarets remained undeterred, dominating Leicester despite winning by just 1 before sinking Luton by 3 thanks to a rare pointer Galazzo the very next day. They call it Easter and fixture congestion. At the other end of it, a salivating title race as all 3 contenders were interlocked on 49 points with very different schedules. Leaders Spurs had only 3 games left, Wolves 4 and Burnley a comparative banquet of 5. You had to say they were favourites now, especially when Spurs pissed away an Easter Monday defeat at home to Chelsea. But then the word on the street was Wolves were back to their best, whilst Burnley returned from Filbert Street hopeless and pointless. Still, the huge landmark of Spurs' visit to Molineux was up next, and it was only a lack of experience keeping Burnley from the mouths of speculative fans attempting to guess the eventual champions. Spurs' triumph in the Black Country combined with Burnley's limp draw at Blackpool kept things interesting. The first of Burnley's games in hand was after their anxious 1-0 win at St Andrews, effectively knocking Spurs off course as the Clarets leapt over them into second. April the 30th was the official end to the league season. Spurs' 4-1 win at Blackpool was futile because of Wolves' even better thrashing of Chelsea at Stamford Bridge, which in turn made Burnley's April coronation futile. Instead, the Clarets edged to a point at home to Fulham, which only served to put their May 2nd trip to Main Road on an even bigger knife edge. Burnley entered the game in 3rd place as one of just 2 teams who could become champions of England. Spurs ahead of them on goal average, out of the race. Wolves with a higher goal average than Burnley were preying on anything but a Burnley win. 66,000 squeaked into Main Road like the sardines that they were, and they would be the only ones to witness what happened inside of the ground. The potential title winning story began with a Brian Pilkington fluke which deflected in off City keeper Bert Troutman of broken neck fame. As was the story of the season, Jimmy McIlroy was playing through the pain barrier and his deeper positioning allowed a nervous Burnley to keep a handle on the game. The second goal came courtesy of Trevor Meredith, a young reserve player who had recovered from a broken leg who cancelled out Joe Hayes' leveller. And whilst Dennis Law had the chance to send the title back to Wolverhampton for the 3rd time on the spin, he blew it. Burnley were the winners, 2-1 in Manchester and over the entire nation. At 80,000 people, there were nearly more in Main Road that evening than what live in Burnley, making them the least populated place to have produced an English football champion ahead of Ipswich and Huddersfield.
The signal from the Spanish referee Echevarria and the European Cup tie begins. Rudzik, not a good clearance, and it's Burnley on this, and comes over the ground, it's goal! A goal in the first minute! Punching it clear, but Ingers putting it back, and Villa trying to bulldoze his way through to McIlroy. McIlroy the pointer, McIlroy, a goal! A goal by McIlroy, 2-0!
Åh, till avslut! Det var till mycket vackert. but qui est marqué par Robson à la 33e minute de jeu, à la suite d'un coup franc. Robson vient d'ouvrir la main. Muller. Oh, très joli. Yeah. Ouais. C'est Anthony, vous le voyez. Oh, très joli. Très joli. 26 minutes. Reims peut encore peut-être... Ouh là là, que c'est dangereux ça. Oh là 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 là. Et c'est Connelly, l'ailier droit britannique. Wendling. Oh joli. Oh. Une magnifique reprise de volée.
That is the grainy old footage of Burnley's first ever games in the European Cup, what you heathens nowadays call the Champions League. And Stade de Reims might be a bang average French team with an unpronounceable name to you these days, but back in the 50s and the 60s they were the cream of European football. The team that used to belong to Raymond Kopa before Real Madrid poached him, that still contained World Cup trivia merchant Just Fontaine, had appeared in 2 of the first 4 European Cup finals, and Burnley had just beaten them. It's the equivalent of them pitching up to PSG and caning them over 2 legs these days. They now had the chance to follow in Reims' footsteps. Next in the quarter-finals were the champions of West Germany.
A lovely one to McElroy, number 8. Now Pointer, very dangerous man there, goes trying to find Robson, living it for Pilkington, a great goal! A lovely goal for Burnley. Boy Miller, that is Pilkington. A great goal! And Pointer, a great save, a goal! Robson has scored! Yes, it's a goal! Robson close to him. Now it's up to Stürmer. And the outside left. Derville moving in the middle. Is he going to get a goal? He has done.
Harris. Das war der erste Treffer der Engländer. Tor! Mit allen 3 Toren beteiligt und jetzt Uwe Seeler. Tor!
And with that, you won't be surprised to learn, was Burnley's first and last foray into the European Cup. Their next and last proper campaign of European football, no, the qualifiers in 2018 definitely don't count, they would also end at the quarter-finals to some Germans, Eintracht Frankfurt in the Fairs Cup in 1967, after they'd eliminated huge names in Stuttgart and Napoli. By then, English football had already set the wheels in motion to make sure that clubs like Burnley wouldn't flourish ever again. If you're of an East Lancashire persuasion, we've recently visited, but to Blackburn. If you've reached this far, you're probably not a fan of them, but we've got other videos from our Tour of Britain playlist here.